On the 10th of April, 1815, Indonesia experienced a massive volcanic eruption.
The eruption of Tambora was one of the largest in the last 1,000 years.
Around 100,000 people died in the eruption, more than ever before due to a volcano. But this was only the beginning. The eruption triggered global climate change. Rain and cold caused dramatic crop failures in the northern hemisphere, and famine stalked large parts of Europe. Anyone who could emigrate did so. Those who had to stay could only fight for survival or rebel.
After Tambora, there was crackdown by the authorities across Europe.
But they were all powerless against one enemy.
Terrible epidemics killed hundreds of thousands of people.
A new and deadly strain of cholera triggered by the freak weather conditions in the Indian subcontinent quickly spread around the world.
It was an epidemic raging out of control.
How could a single volcano at the other end of the world cause so much death and suffering? Tambora's effect on the climate lasted for generations, shaping the Industrial Revolution and causing widespread political and social upheaval. Now, 200 years after its eruption, historians, geoscientists, climate researchers, and geneticists are working together for the first time to determine how Tambora changed the world. American environmental historian Gillen Darcy Wood from the University of Illinois is in London, tracking the global consequences of the Tambora eruption and how it shaped the 19th century world. London's Tate Gallery houses the largest collection of British artworks from that period, including works by the famous Romantic landscape painter John Constable. Constable's depictions of clouds make him an important chronicler of the global weather catastrophe following Tambora's eruption.
Constable sees himself as a kind of scientist of the skies, as a painterly meteorologist. The history of European landscape painting up until this time, the background at the horizon and the sky has been more or less decorative or ornamental, with generic depictions of clouds. The way in which Constable's style converges with the story of Tambora is that owing to Tambora's eruption, the 18 teens are the cloudiest and wettest decade of the millennium.
But people in Europe still didn't suspect that their misery had been caused by a natural disaster on the other side of the world, on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. 200 years on, the 2,850-meter-high volcano's flanks are covered by vegetation, and its crater rim gives little sign of the cataclysmic force of its eruption. Geologist Ralph Gertesser from Kiel University in the United Kingdom is surveying the area around the volcano. Born in Freiburg, he has been working on Tambora for years and is one of few experts to carry out field research there. He's trying to reconstruct the exact course and extent of the eruption.
I
used this rangefinder to measure the height of the wall. The wall was formed by deposits left by the pyroclastic flow from the Tambora eruption in 1815. We've got about 9 meters of deposits here.
The vast amount of material comes from a mountain that was once over 4,000 meters high. The volcano had been dormant for centuries before its sudden reawakening in 1815. At the time, nobody had any inkling that Tambora would wipe out Sumbawa's population in a matter of days. 200 years later, archaeologists are searching for traces of the people who once lived here. Many archaeologists call it the Pompeii of the East because, like the ancient Roman city, the settlements around the volcano were suddenly buried by an avalanche of hot ash. So far, just 4 buildings have been unearthed, but archaeologists suspect that an entire village could be buried under their feet. It's a major project still in its infancy. Scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg are using computer simulations to investigate the fallout from the Tambora eruption and chart climatic changes around the world in its wake. They have worked out various scenarios, almost all of which show severe disruptions to global weather systems. They base their calculations on the location, time, and duration of the eruption, as well as the size and altitude of the clouds of sulfurous gases it releases into the atmosphere. In Tambora's case, at least 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide were blasted more than 20 kilometers up into the stratosphere, where high winds spread it around the globe. Average annual temperatures dropped sharply in many parts of the world. At the British Library in London, Darcy Wood is comparing the results of the climate researchers' simulations with contemporary records. There he discovers a source that sheds a completely new light on the consequences of the Tambora eruption from a region that researchers have largely overlooked so far, the Bay of Bengal in northeastern India. It's a medical book written by James Jameson, a doctor the British government sent to report on an increase of cholera outbreaks in the region. But Jameson started with about 80 pages of detailed weather records, the most meticulous description of the consequences of the Tambora eruption available to historians today. Jameson's records clearly show that the normal alternation between the dry and monsoon periods in India was completely disrupted from 1816 onwards.
He had an interest in meteorology, an interest in medicine, interest in public health, and in this case, in humanitarian disaster. And he saw himself as a writer who charged with capturing all of these things in one text.
May 1816. Winds from the sea usually bring heavy rains during the monsoon season, but not a drop had fallen this year, and the country was facing a severe drought. A fall in temperatures meant differences between sea and land were too small to draw humid air inland, and the fields were dry as a bone. The poor rural population was facing a severe crop failure. The turning point finally came 3 months later than usual, at the end of August, as the winds swept in the sorely needed rains. But they also brought catastrophe, even by Indian standards. Rivers burst their banks, sluicing away precious fertile soil. The weather turbulence continued for the next 2 years. Jameson's meticulous records made him the most important chronicler of the most profound distortions of the monsoon system since time immemorial. In Bengal, the chaotic weather laid the ground for a devastating outbreak of cholera, which would soon make history worldwide. cholera bacteria have always naturally occurred in the ecosystem of the nutrient-rich brackish water. During the monsoon season, myriad rivers in the region flush large quantities of nutrients into the sea. Plankton carpets form on the surface of the water. But in 1816, the unprecedentedly long dry spells led to an explosion of plankton and also of cholera bacteria. The high concentration and rapid spread of the pathogens infected more people than ever before. Within a few days, cholera causes a life-threatening loss of bodily fluids that often leads to death. Ralf Gertese is on his way back to Tambora. Helicopter is the only way to reach the inside of the deep crater at all. Sumbawa today looks like a tropical paradise of rainforests and coral reefs. But above it all, the brooding volcano. The volcanologist has already been up to the volcano's rim once. It took him several days to climb up it on foot, so he knows there's no way down into the gigantic crater. It's his long-cherished dream to stand on its floor. At last, the chopper touches down on the crater floor, where hardly anyone has ever set foot before. But he doesn't have a lot of time. The pilot can't risk switching off the engine. If it doesn't start again, they'll be stranded because there is no radio or phone coverage in the crater. Gertese walks to the foot of the crater wall to make his measurements. Here, we can see the elemental force still slumbering close to the surface.
If we go to the edge of the crater, we can see volcanic gases escaping, indicating that the volcano is still very active. The gases consist mainly of water vapor, but you can also see elemental sulfur forming around the gas vents, a magmatic gas originating from the still active magma reservoir inside the volcano.
Today, the volcano is barely 3,000 meters high, which means it lost around 1,200 meters, i.e. one-third of its height in the huge eruption. The unimaginable blast devastated the whole island and buried it under meters of ash. But it's completely unclear why such a gigantic eruption occurred at all, let alone whether it could happen again now. Because of its remote location, volcanologists have hardly been able to carry out any research into Tambora at all. Now, Gertese is using rock samples from the different layers to reconstruct the volcano's history. He can read the deposits like a book.
Samples from the 1815 deposits teach us a lot about the processes within the volcano before it erupted. For example, by analyzing these samples, we can determine how far below the surface the magma chamber was, and where the magma was, and how long it had been there before the eruption. We can also use an array of analytical methods to work out the magma's gas content and how much sulfurous gas was released during the eruption.
Den Gasgehalt der Magmen bestimmen und wie viel Schwefelgas zum Beispiel während der Eruption freigesetzt wurde.
The sulfur formed tiny droplets, so-called aerosols, in the stratosphere, and they reflected much of the sun's energy back into space and dispersed or absorbed the rest. That meant much less heat reached the Earth's surface and temperatures dropped. It took several years for the particles to sink back down to the ground. The Museum of Bread Culture in Ulm preserves the memory of these years in southern Germany to this day. The kingdom of Württemberg was particularly hard hit by the climatic turbulence.
We
know today that 1816 had a very, very bad harvest due to freak weather conditions. This proverbial year without summer has gone down in history. Bad weather, lots of thunderstorms, and very little sunshine led to a disastrously poor harvest.
The spring had already been extremely cold and wet, so some farmers weren't able to sow their fields until the end of April. Some merchants had recognized the early signs of a bad harvest and were moving from village to village buying up the farmers' remaining stores of grain. The pious Swabians thought they were getting a good deal. But it was the merchants who really profited. As the price of grain soared in the next few months, many became very rich and hated.
Das Ganze ist 200 Jahre her, das heißt, da haben wir eine gute Dokumentenlage.
The whole thing was 200 years ago, so we have plenty of evidence.
Hier in der Ausstellung einen Stettnerschen
For example, the exhibition features one of Stettner's hollow medals with miniature pictures and text describing the famine.
die eben diese Hungersnot beschreiben. Und man sieht vor allem fast auf jedem Bild.
Almost every picture features thunderstorms and incredibly dark skies.
Ein unglaublich dunkler Himmel. Also das hat
So this incomprehensibly strange weather, this climatic change, must have made a huge impression on people who had never experienced anything like it.
Summer 1816, near Lake Geneva. A young British couple, both aspiring writers, were visiting their old friend, Lord Byron. But their excursions into the countryside were thwarted by unusually cold weather. The couple had landed at the epicenter of a Europe-wide climate catastrophe. As the harvest in eastern Switzerland failed, starving farmers left the barren mountain regions and desperately wandered through the country in search of something to eat. Byron quickly got his friends away from the beggars and out of the raging storms.
This summer is foul. Almost constant rain keeps us tied to the house. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld.
These remarks came from 18-year-old Mary Goodwin, who was later to become famous under the name Mary Shelley. The young writer was already working on a Gothic novel that would mark the birth of modern horror literature. Frankenstein is the story of a scientist who creates a monster on a stormy night. But it was the poor who really suffered the true horror of these months. The situation in Switzerland, France, and southern Germany was deteriorating fast. As the famine spread, people stole out of desperation. Many hadn't had a regular meal for a long time and were completely emaciated. Malnutrition diminishes the body's defenses. Hundreds of thousands of people in Central Europe were affected.
Es waren über 50% der Haushalte, die wirklich
More than 50% of the households were really poor and really hungry.
sehr viel Und es sind auch Menschen gestorben.
That's a huge number, and people were already starving to death.
Es gab dann in der Folge der Hungersnot auch
The famine also caused terrible epidemics that killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Auch Hunderttausende von Menschen gestorben.
Tambora's trail even takes us to Philadelphia, a metropolis of millions on the east coast of the USA. Here, amidst the skyscrapers at the College of Physicians, we find the Mutter Museum, which houses one of the USA's most important medical history collections. Surrounded by bizarre medical specimens, paleogeneticist Hendrik Poinar has discovered unique evidence of Tambora's deadly legacy even decades after its eruption. What is special about this collection is that many preparations date back to a time when tissues and organs were still preserved in alcohol and not in formalin. That means remnants of pathogens that would otherwise have been destroyed have been preserved.
What do we have here?
All right, so these are...
Part of the collection comprises samples taken from the intestinal tracts of cholera victims. They were harvested during the cholera epidemic that struck Philadelphia in 1849 and claimed more than 1,000 lives.
Cholera is strictly a disease of the gut, so there's no way to get it from skeletal material. So there's really almost no way to study the history of cholera from a normal skeletal cholera burial, for example, which exists actually all over the globe. You can find cholera pits. This was, a dream come true for us because we could actually sample these collections, and then using the technology that we use to pull out these small snippets of DNA, we could actually reconstruct this genome.
Genetic analysis of these cholera bacteria shows a direct correlation to the cholera epidemics reported by James Jameson in Bengal in 1816.
It was quite clear that this is a strain that had its origin sitting in the Indian subcontinent and then spreads by, as we know today, by travel, trade, boats, shipping companies that eventually then seed these cholera human-specific adapted strains into the New World and parts of Europe, basically across the globe. Goes from a localized epidemic in the Indian subcontinent to this larger pandemic worldwide.
Cholera was initially spread through Southeast Asia by soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims, reaching the Philippines, Japan, and China before finally moving west by both land and sea routes to Persia, and from there on to Russia. By the early 1830s, it had reached Central Europe and finally North and South America by sea via England. The eruption of a volcano in Indonesia had turned cholera into a global killer for the first time. Millions of people perished.
What happens is...
London, with 5 million inhabitants, then the largest city in the world, was particularly badly hit. Cholera spread like wildfire through the city's filthy and poverty-stricken slums, which were often built on former swamps near the Thames. The first epidemic in 1832 claimed several thousand lives, and even more in 3 subsequent outbreaks over the next 3 decades.
The Thames got to such a disgusting state that quite literally the awful smell of all of this sewage in London's river arrived at the doors of the House of Parliament. And the politicians had to do something in their own self-interest. So they helped to create the London Metropolitan Board of Works that would create this grand intercepting sewer to try and clean up the Thames and help to solve the problem of cholera. Yeah, because this area...
An extensive and interlinked sewage system proved to be the key in the fight against cholera by diverting much of the city's wastewater into the Thames downstream from the capital.
Into the river.
Similar measures in many parts of the world finally stopped the spread of cholera, but it has still not completely died out even today. Back in Indonesia, Ralf Gertisse is on his way to one of the archaeologists' digs. He's curious to see what they found so far. The excavations are going well, and Sonny Wibisono's team has uncovered another building. Archaeologists can tell from the remnants that it had been built on stilts and that its walls were decorated with palm wickerwork. At the back was the kitchen, which is recognizable from the many stones that mark the fireplace.
Most in the middle of the house actually, originally.
But apart from the fireplace, Wibisono is keen to show Geertens something else that he's found. Human bones. It's only the 5th set of skeletal remains they have found so far. What's strange is that these bones aren't as charred as the others. Another surprise is this is the only victim they can find, although the house seems to have been built for an extended family.
Maybe the people who lived there had already fled, perhaps during the first phase of the eruption on April 5th. This could mean that there were only a few people left here, which would explain why we have found very few bodies here so far.
The scientists gradually managed to piece together an exact picture of the volcanic eruption. Tambora was a huge mountain back then, towering some 4,200 meters into the sky. Down below, the magma chamber, about 1,000 meters below sea level, was full, but the initial eruption on April 5th was relatively minor. That led the locals to underestimate the danger, and they stayed put even as ash began to fall on their village. But 5 days later, things got dramatically worse.
At the height of the eruption, on the 10th of April, there was an enormous explosion.
Up to 50 cubic kilometers of ash and rock were forced out of the volcano's chimney, forming a column that rose 43 kilometers into the air. The earth shook, and the volcano growled. Nobody there knew what that meant, nor that they only had a few hours left to live.
After about 2 or 3 hours, the eruption column completely collapsed in on itself and flowed down the slopes of the volcano in so-called pyroclastic currents, 400 to 500 degrees in temperature and moving at between 100 and 200 kilometers an hour. These currents destroy everything in their path. This is what caused the more than 10,000 direct fatalities during the eruption.
Traces of the Tambora catastrophe can still be seen in Greenland today, preserved in the island's glaciers like an archive of climate history. In the years following the eruption, the stratospheric aerosols slowly died down and snowflakes crystallized on the particles, which ended up trapped in the ice. The researchers at a camp on the ice used drills to penetrate deep into the glacier. It's back-breaking toil in the service of climate research, which is possible only a few weeks a year. But it's worth it. The ice cores they extract enable a complete reconstruction of the climate of the past, down to the exact year. Researchers from all over the world come to this special laboratory at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven to examine ice samples from the Earth's polar regions at -20 degrees Celsius. Ice cores are vital for the reconstruction of volcanic eruptions because they cover such long periods of time. These ice cores come from a place even more remote than Greenland, the interior of the Antarctic. Even here, researchers have found Tambora's fingerprints.
if we look back in the past, how frequent were volcanic eruptions the size of Tambora? In the last 200 years, the Tambora volcano is the most important eruption of our recent past. The Kauai eruption in 1458 is another very large one, and then we have a series of eruptions in the 1250s, and before then there's many eruptions that you can look at back through time.
That means huge eruptions with global consequences have been far more frequent than previously believed. Mankind has probably experienced several such crises, and Tambora won't be the last. In southern Germany, the sudden climate change and famine spurred a first wave of immigration. In Ulm, hundreds of immigrants made their way down the river Danube in simple wooden rowing boats, so-called Ulmer boxes. They'd accepted an invitation from the Tsar of Russia, who had promised land and Russian citizenship to anyone who wanted to flee to his country. Many people also sought their fortunes on the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States. But most of the people there were already bracing themselves for the next disaster. The U.S. East Coast had also been hit by severe turbulence after the Tambora eruption. Thomas Jefferson, the former U.S. president and father of the Declaration of Independence, had been running his Monticello plantation in Virginia for many years. The region's climate was comparatively mild, and he had made a lot of money from it so far. But it was a deceptive idyll, as the records of his crop yields prove. From 1816 onwards, drought, cold, and thunderstorms repeatedly destroy parts of his harvest. 1816 has gone down as one of the coldest years in American history. Hoping for better weather, Jefferson repeatedly took out new loans and eventually went bankrupt. The whole east coast of the USA was affected by the terrible weather, with drastic consequences.
After 1816, the United States witnessed a massive demographic upheaval. Economic refugees from New England and down the Atlantic seaboard abandoning their farms and villages and moving en masse westward. It's the first large-scale westward migration in US history.
However, Indonesia suffered the most serious consequences. Even 500 kilometers away from the volcano itself, everything was buried in ash. The livelihood of the rural population was destroyed for decades. The people who had escaped the clouds of embers and ashes now faced an equally merciless enemy: hunger. An estimated 100,000 people died as the indirect result of the eruption in Indonesia, and several ethnic groups were entirely wiped out. Nature has since recaptured Sumbawa, and trees once more cover Tambora's flanks. People have long since resettled at the foot of the volcano. But the sleeping giant still lurks in the background. Volcanologists are sure it will erupt again. They just don't know when or how big it will be.
The problem is that we actually know relatively little about Tambora. We know a lot about the 1815 eruption, but very little about the older ones. So it's very hard to predict how long it'll be before it has another great eruption as it did in 1815.
Meanwhile, the situation in Europe was getting worse by the day as people started to die from harmless infectious diseases. The official cause of death? Emaciation. Fortunat Fowler was a priest from Sigmaringen. Helplessly watching his parishioners starve to death, he tried to preach a gospel of hope. but in vain. He and his cousin desperately looked for a way out. Perhaps, they thought, the forest could provide nutritious herbs, roots, or fruits as an alternative to the insanely expensive bread made from pure grain. Their early experiments were a failure, but they kept on going. Documents in the Museum for Bread Culture in Ulm show they weren't the only ones looking for new recipes at the time. When Fowler and his cousin started kneading potatoes into the dough, it marked the turning point in his search. In retrospect, potato bread in southern Germany was perhaps the most important culinary invention of the 19th century. Its success was also due to the fact that the potato harvest, in contrast to the grain harvest, wasn't a total write-off. A baker could therefore sell potato bread much more cheaply than bread made from wheat flour. King Wilhelm I of Württemberg wanted to alleviate the suffering of his subjects, so he duplicated the recipe and handed it out to the public.
König Wilhelm
Wilhelm understood such a symbolic policy very well. So he set up kitchens for the poor and took other social measures. That created a very positive impression, and it assured the population that the government was on the side of the little people, and that they could trust it to do the right thing.
In France, on the other hand, famine led to riots in some parts of the country. Many of the rioters had lived through the French Revolution and reverted to tried and tested methods to get food. But their targets in this case weren't the political elites, but mainly traders and merchants. Across the Channel in Britain, however, the longer the famine lasted, the more politically explosive the issue of crop failures became.
The greatest threat to Europe was not the extreme weather itself, but its impact on food yields, on agriculture, and reporting in the newspapers becomes more conflicted and political. In fact, the government of Lord Liverpool in Britain in 1816 suppressed its usual publication of grain yields and crop yields in the summer and fall of 1816, precisely because they did not want this information widely known. They did not want panic.
One measure taken was the construction of the Regent's Canal in North London, which was built between 1816 and 1819 to provide a livelihood for the many unemployed and starving poor.
The idea is that you better connect agricultural production with market towns so that in future events of food shortages and economic distress, that cities like London would be better connected. Prior to the late 18 teens and the Tamboran emergency, governments felt no such responsibility toward their citizens. So we see the beginning of a new era of proactive government intervention and involvement in social improvement and public works and humanitarian relief.
But such moves did little to diffuse rising public anger. Despite the crisis, Parliament refused to rescind the controversial corn laws, which used heavy taxation on grain to keep prices high. But the situation finally exploded, and massive riots took place in London and other British cities. The disturbances climaxed in Manchester with the so-called Peterloo Massacre.
You have crowds of unarmed women and children set upon by guardsmen on horses wielding swords and machetes, sort of slicing their way through the crowd. You have a death toll in the dozens. It's one of the most notorious instances of state violence inflicted on the British population in the years after Waterloo. Peterloo Massacre energises progressive and reformist forces in Britain. It exposes the corruption and violence of the ruling classes in England, and eventually leading to a more liberal social regime coming out of 1832 and the Reform Bill.
The Tambora eruption 200 years ago had almost faded into history until today's scientists started to look at it more closely. The world may have experienced a severe crisis in the years following the eruption, but famine, rebellion, and disease also forced many countries to make positive changes. The fear of cholera drove the elites to install sewage systems in the big cities. Without functioning sewers, today's modern megacities wouldn't exist. Sudden climate change triggered the first waves of immigration in the 19th century and accelerated the westward expansion of the United States. In Europe, fear of the starving masses prompted major political reforms that ultimately led to the development of the welfare state. All of these developments and more were consequences of the volcanic eruption that changed the world.